I used to think that if someone was following you, you would know immediately. You picture obvious things: fast footsteps behind you, a stranger calling after you, someone breaking into a run. That is not how it happens. The person who followed me home never once tried to catch me. That is what still bothers me. It happened on a cold Friday night in early December after I closed the convenience store where I worked. We were short staffed, so I stayed nearly an hour later than usual, cleaning and stocking shelves. By the time I locked the front doors, it was almost 11:45 p.m. The streets were damp from a light rain that had stopped only a few minutes earlier. The air smelled like wet pavement and wood smoke from nearby fireplaces. Most of the businesses around me had already gone dark, and the only sounds came from the buzzing streetlights and the occasional car passing through an intersection without stopping. My apartment was just under 2 miles away. I had made the walk dozens of times before. It was quiet, well lit for the most part, and usually uneventful. That night felt different before I had even left the parking lot. There was a man standing on the sidewalk across the street. He was dressed in a gray hooded sweatshirt beneath a dark jacket. His hands were buried in his pockets, and his hood was pulled low enough that I could not make out his face. He was not looking at his phone or smoking a cigarette. He was simply standing there, watching the store. I remember thinking it was strange, but not alarming. Maybe he was waiting for someone to finish work. Maybe he was waiting for a ride. I started walking. Out of habit, I glanced back once before turning the corner. The man was still standing there. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets and continued along the sidewalk, trying to ignore the cold. Christmas lights hung from a few houses, casting soft colors across the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before everything became quiet again. About 5 minutes later, I crossed through a four-way intersection. As I stepped onto the opposite sidewalk, I looked behind me. The man was walking now. He was almost half a block away, not close enough to concern me, not far enough to dismiss. I kept telling myself it was a public sidewalk. People walk the same direction all the time. I forced myself not to look back again. Another 2 blocks passed. The neighborhood became darker. Several streetlights were burned out, leaving long stretches of sidewalk lit only by the glow from nearby houses. That uneasy feeling settled into my stomach. You know the feeling. The one where nothing has happened yet, but your instincts quietly begin asking questions your brain keeps trying to answer logically. I looked over my shoulder. He was still there. Same pace, same distance. I stopped beside a mailbox and pretended to retie my shoe. He did not stop. He kept walking. For a second, I felt embarrassed. Maybe he had never been following me at all. Then, just as he reached the spot where I had stopped, he stopped too. Not beside me, not across from me, exactly where I had first noticed him slowing down. He bent over as if checking something near his shoe. Neither of us moved. The silence around us suddenly felt enormous. After about 15 seconds, I stood and continued walking. A few moments later, his footsteps returned, steady, measured, never gaining on me, never falling farther behind. I pulled out my phone. 3% battery, no signal. That annoyed me more than it frightened me. Reception in that neighborhood usually wasn't great. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept moving. Halfway home, I decided to test my suspicion. There was a small 24-hour laundromat on the next corner. I had no reason to go inside, but I opened the door anyway. The warmth hit me immediately. Only one elderly man sat reading a newspaper while several machines tumbled quietly along the back wall. I pretended to check the vending machine while watching through the front windows. A minute passed, then the man walked by. He never looked toward the laundromat. He never slowed down. He simply continued down the sidewalk until he disappeared around the corner. I actually laughed. I had worked myself into believing I was being followed for no reason. I waited another 5 minutes just to be sure before stepping back outside. The street was empty. Feeling ridiculous, I started toward home again. When I reached the corner where I had last seen him, he was waiting, not hiding, not pretending to do anything, just standing beneath a broken streetlight, looking directly at me. Every muscle in my body tightened. I immediately crossed the street. He waited. Then he crossed too. Not quickly, not aggressively, just enough to remain on the same side of the road as me. That was the moment everything changed. Until then, I had been trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Now I knew. He wanted me to know he was there. My breathing became shallow. I looked ahead. Home was still nearly 15 minutes away. The streets had emptied completely. Every house seemed dark. Every porch light suddenly felt too far apart. I considered running. Instead, I walked faster. So did he. I slowed again. So did he. He never closed the distance. He did not need to. He already had my attention. As I turned onto the longest street of my walk, I heard another set of footsteps ahead of me. A man stepped out from between two parked cars. He wore a baseball cap and carried a backpack. He glanced at me for only a second before continuing toward the opposite end of the block. Relief washed over me. Finally, another person. Without thinking, I called out, "Hey!" He stopped. I jogged toward him. I know this is going to sound weird, but I think someone's been following me. His eyes immediately shifted past my shoulder. He frowned. That guy? I turned. The sidewalk behind me was empty, completely empty. "What do you mean?" I asked. "The man in the gray hoodie," he replied. "He was about 20 feet behind you." I stared. "There isn't anyone there?" He looked confused. "There was literally someone behind you." He took another look. "Where'd he go?" Neither of us said anything. There were no driveways close enough. No alleys, no parked vans, no fences left open. 1 second, someone had been following me. The next, the street was empty. The stranger looked uncomfortable. "I'd head home," he said quietly. "I don't think I'd walk alone tonight." He left before I could ask anything else. Now I was truly alone. I hurried the remaining blocks, constantly checking behind me. Nothing, no footsteps, no movement. When I finally reached my apartment building, I unlocked the entrance, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor, unlocked my apartment, locked every lock, checked every room. Nothing. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes, laughing nervously at how badly I had frightened myself. Then I remembered something. My bedroom window overlooked the sidewalk in front of the building. I walked over and carefully pulled the curtain aside. The sidewalk was empty. I smiled, finally, proof that I had made it home safely. Then I noticed something reflected in the glass, not outside, inside my apartment. Someone was standing in the dark hallway behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell. The hallway was empty. Every light was still off. Every door was exactly where I had left it. I searched the apartment again. Nothing. I never saw the man after that night. At least, not in person. 3 days later, I stopped by the convenience store before my shift started. One of my co-workers was pinning a stack of flyers to the employee bulletin board. "Missing person," she said. "They're everywhere this morning." I barely looked at it. Then my eyes locked on the photograph. Gray hoodie, dark jacket, the same face I had seen beneath the streetlight. According to the flyer, he had disappeared 6 days before the night he followed me home. There is one rule I follow now whenever I walk alone at night. If I see the same stranger more than twice, I don't wait to find out if it's a coincidence. I leave. People tell me that I'm paranoid. Maybe I am, but they weren't there that night. It was a little after 10:30 on a Wednesday when I left the restaurant where I worked. We had been unusually busy, and by the time I finished cleaning my section and counted my tips, the streets had emptied out. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and a damp breeze pushed loose leaves across the sidewalk. I put my earbuds in, but never started any music. I liked looking busy when I walked alone, but I also wanted to hear what was happening around me. My apartment was just over a mile away. It was a route I had walked hundreds of times. The first time I noticed him, he was standing on the opposite corner waiting for the crosswalk signal. He looked completely ordinary. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Dark jacket, blue jeans, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't looking at anyone. When the signal changed, we crossed in opposite directions without making eye contact. I forgot about him almost immediately. 2 blocks later, I reached another intersection. As I waited for the light, someone stepped up beside the traffic pole across the street, the same man. I frowned. That didn't make much sense. He should have been walking away from me after our first encounter. Instead, somehow, he was in front of me again. I watched him carefully. The signal changed. He crossed without looking at me. I crossed too. By the time I reached the opposite sidewalk and glanced back, he was gone. There were several businesses nearby, so I assumed he had ducked inside one of them. I kept walking. Another 5 minutes passed. The sidewalks became quieter as I entered a residential neighborhood. Streetlights were farther apart now, leaving long patches of darkness between pools of yellow light. When I reached the next intersection, he was already there, waiting. This time, he looked directly at me, not aggressively, not smiling, just watching. I felt that familiar knot form in my stomach. I looked away. The pedestrian signal changed. We crossed again. As I reached the opposite curb, I couldn't resist looking back. He was standing in the middle of the crosswalk, not moving, watching me continue down the street. I picked up my pace. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe we simply had overlapping routes. Still, 3 intersections, the same man. Something about it felt wrong. I pulled out my phone, 1% battery. Perfect. I considered calling someone anyway, but the phone died before I could unlock it. I slipped it back into my pocket and kept walking. The next few blocks were lined with older homes. Their porch lights illuminated empty driveways and neatly trimmed hedges. Somewhere in the distance, a television echoed through an open window. Otherwise, silence. I reached another intersection. Before I even looked up, I already knew. He was there, standing beneath the streetlight, waiting, only this time, he wasn't alone. An older woman stood beside him with a grocery bag in one hand. Relief flooded through me. Maybe I'd been imagining everything. People don't stalk someone while casually standing next to strangers. The signal changed. The woman crossed. The man didn't. He remained exactly where he was. Watching me, the woman passed within a few feet of me. Without slowing down, she quietly said, "Don't go straight." I stopped walking. What? She kept moving. She never looked back. Within seconds, she disappeared into the darkness behind me. I turned toward the intersection again. The man was gone. Every instinct told me to head home as quickly as possible. Instead, I listened to the stranger. I turned right. The street was unfamiliar. I had never walked this way before. It curved through a neighborhood of older apartment buildings before reconnecting with my usual route. I told myself I was overreacting. Then I heard footsteps, not behind me. Ahead. I slowed. The footsteps slowed. Someone stepped around the corner 50 yards in front of me. The baseball cap, the dark jacket. He had somehow gotten ahead of me again. I stopped completely. So did he. We stared at each other across the empty street. Then he smiled. It wasn't a threatening smile. It looked more like someone who had just confirmed something, like a puzzle piece had fallen into place. I immediately turned around and walked the opposite direction. I didn't care where I ended up anymore. I only wanted to put distance between us. For nearly 10 minutes, I wandered through streets I barely recognized. Finally, I reached a gas station that was still open. I hurried inside. The cashier looked up from his phone. "You okay?" "I think someone's following me." He glanced toward the windows. "I don't see anybody." I looked too. The parking lot was empty. No one. I stayed inside for almost 15 minutes. Bought a bottle of water I didn't want. Pretended to scroll through my dead phone. Eventually, I convinced myself the man had given up. When I stepped back outside, the air had grown colder. The streets were quieter than ever. Home was only another 10-minute walk. I took a different route. Halfway there, I noticed something taped to a utility pole. A missing cat flyer. Without thinking, I stopped to read it. Then I froze. Someone had written beneath the phone number in fresh black marker, "You missed him again." The ink still looked wet. I looked around. Empty sidewalks, dark houses, no movement. A chill ran through me. There was no way that message had been meant for me. Was there? I walked faster. Every few seconds I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. No footsteps. No man. No baseball cap. When I finally reached my apartment building, I hurried inside and locked the entrance behind me. Safe. At least I thought so. The next morning, I woke to someone knocking on my apartment door. It was my landlord. "There was a complaint," he said. "About what?" He looked confused. "One of the tenants said someone stood outside your apartment for almost an hour last night." My mouth went dry. "What did they look like?" He shrugged. Middle-aged guy, wearing a baseball cap. I never told him about the walk home. I never told anyone about the woman who warned me, but I still think about one thing. If I had ignored her, if I had kept walking straight, I have no idea who or what I would have met at the next intersection. I used to believe that fear was something your mind created before danger actually arrived. A shadow looked like a person. A strange noise became something worse than it really was. A feeling in your stomach became a warning, even when there was no reason to be afraid. That is what I told myself every time I heard the footsteps behind me that night. I kept telling myself there was nothing there. The problem was, the footsteps never stopped. It was a Tuesday night in February, and I had stayed late at work finishing a project that I had been putting off for weeks. By the time I shut down my computer and walked out of the office building, it was almost 12:15 a.m. The city felt completely different at that hour. During the day, the streets were crowded with people rushing to work, delivery trucks stopping at corners, and cars filling every parking space. At midnight, the same streets felt abandoned. The buildings were still there, but they felt empty, like the city had been turned off. My apartment was about 35 minutes away on foot. Normally, I would have taken the subway, but the nearest station was closed for repairs. and I didn't want to wait 20 minutes for a rideshare. I had made the walk before. I knew the route. I wasn't worried. At least I wasn't worried when I started. The first 10 minutes were completely normal. I walked beneath the orange glow of streetlights, passing closed restaurants and dark storefronts. My hands were buried in my coat pockets, and I kept my eyes forward. Then I heard the footsteps. At first, I barely noticed them. Everyone hears footsteps at night. The problem was that they matched mine. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they sped up. I stopped walking. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. No voices. No cars. No movement. I turned around. The sidewalk behind me stretched for nearly a block. There was nobody there. I actually laughed. A nervous laugh. The kind you make when you realize you've scared yourself. I shook my head and started walking again. A minute later, the footsteps returned. This time I paid attention. They weren't echoing. They weren't coming from another street. They were directly behind me. I glanced at the reflection in the windows of the buildings beside me. I could see myself walking. I could see the empty sidewalk behind me. No one else. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. I decided to cross the street. If someone was actually behind me, I wanted to see if they followed. I waited for the traffic light, crossed, kept walking. 10 seconds later, the footsteps crossed too. My stomach tightened. I didn't look back. I kept moving. The next block had a row of parked cars along the curb, and the darkness between them made it difficult to see clearly. I started wondering if someone was using the cars as cover. That thought made me walk faster. Then something happened that I still cannot explain. The footsteps changed. Before they had sounded like normal shoes on pavement. Now they sounded heavier, slower, closer. I could hear the scrape of the soles. I could hear the rhythm. 1 step. 2 steps, 3. My heart started pounding. I reached for my phone. I had 8% battery. I opened my contacts. Before I could call anyone, my phone vibrated. A notification appeared. Motion detected at front door camera. I froze. I didn't even have a front door camera. I opened the notification. It was from a security app I had installed months earlier and completely forgotten about. My apartment building had recently installed cameras in the hallway. The alert was showing a screenshot. Someone was standing outside my apartment door. I stared at the image. The quality was poor. The hallway was dim. But I could clearly see a person standing there, facing the camera, facing my door. I stopped walking. The footsteps behind me stopped too. For several seconds, I stood completely still. Then I slowly turned around. The sidewalk was empty. No one. Nothing. Just the quiet street stretching behind me. My phone buzzed again, another notification. This time it was a video clip. I pressed play. The footage showed the hallway outside my apartment. The person was still there, standing motionless. Then, slowly, they raised their hand and knocked on my door. I stared at the screen. My apartment was 35 minutes away. There was no possible way that person was me, or anyone who had gotten there after following me. I immediately called my building manager. No answer. I called a friend. No answer. I started walking again. This time, I wasn't trying to get home. I was trying to get somewhere with people. I walked toward a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away. The footsteps followed, but something had changed. They were no longer trying to hide. They were closer. Much closer. I reached the diner entrance and pushed through the door. The warmth hit me instantly. A waitress looked up. "Can I help you?" I looked behind me. The sidewalk outside was empty. "I think someone is following me." She glanced outside. "Do you want me to call someone?" I almost said yes. Then my phone buzzed again, another security alert. I looked down. A new image appeared. The person outside my apartment door was no longer standing in the hallway. They were inside my apartment. The camera angle had changed. I could see my living room, my couch, my television, my lamp, and someone standing in the middle of the room. I stared at the image. Then I noticed something. The person was holding a phone pointed toward the camera, as if they were recording me watching them. The waitress asked if I was okay. I couldn't answer. I just showed her the screen. She immediately stepped back. "Call the police." I did. The officers arrived 20 minutes later. They checked my apartment. Nobody was inside. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. The only strange thing they found was my bedroom window. It was unlocked. I never leave my bedroom window unlocked. The next morning, the building manager reviewed the security footage. The hallway camera had captured someone entering the building. But there was a problem. The person never came through the front entrance. They never used the elevator. They never walked up the stairs. The first recording showed them already standing outside my apartment door. The manager asked me a question I still think about. Do you know anyone who would have a reason to scare you? I told him no. Then he showed me something else. A second camera from the lobby. It showed me leaving the building the previous morning, walking to work, except in the reflection of the glass doors behind me, someone was standing inside the lobby, watching me leave. I moved out 2 weeks later. I still walk alone at night sometimes, but I have one rule now. If I hear footsteps behind me, I don't turn around, because I learned something that night. The scariest thing about being followed is not knowing who is behind you. It's realizing they might not be behind you anymore.